We've seen in our study of Hinduism so far that the tradition is quite complex and very diverse. So in this video, I'm just going to look at a couple of other kind of approaches maybe to the Hindu faith and to the Hindu life. And this is going to look at yoga and Tantra. So we'll start with yoga. We've already seen the term yoga show up from the Bhagavad Gita. This word has been used in a lot of different ways throughout the history of Hinduism. In the Bhagavad Gita, it was used kind of in a broadest sense of simply meaning a path or a way. So we looked at those three paths to liberation, the karma yoga, jnana yoga, and bhakti yoga. Here we're thinking more specifically of yoga as a specific type of practice that has been popular within Hinduism for quite some time and has also now become popular in some regards outside of the Hindu tradition. So here we're thinking of yoga as a spiritual, physical, and mental discipline that is supposed to lead to some sort of religious experience, whether it is a connection with the divine or whether it is that kind of unifying kind of knowledge of reality that the Upanishad spoke of. It depends on your perspective and which community you are practicing yoga within, but yoga typically is this kind of physical, spiritual, and mental discipline that is leading to a religious goal. The physical side will include things like bodily postures, stretching, breathing, things like that. We're not sure exactly where yoga originated or when. We do remember that some of the early images of figures that show up in the Harappa culture or the Indus Valley civilization seem to show individuals in postures that will eventually become important for yoga. So maybe yoga, a kind of meditation that dealt with breathing and with stretching and bodily postures, maybe that was already part of the religious life of the Indus Valley civilization, and maybe that was one thing that perhaps was borrowed as the Indo-Europeans then created the Vedas and began what we call Hinduism. So that's all we really need to know about yoga within the Hindu context. It is, of course, interesting, especially for those of us living in the West, to see how yoga has become so popular, right? You can go to almost any city in America and find yoga classes, yoga studios, different kinds of yoga. And clearly there is the kind of appropriation in some ways of the physical, at least, and perhaps mental elements of Hindu yoga into non-Hindu contexts. What is often lost, of course, is the theoretical or spiritual or religious foundations to the practice within Hinduism. There have been some interesting court cases as well about yoga being used within public school systems, right? Even where I teach at Kirkwood, there are yoga classes that you can take. And of course, that always begs the question about, in America, the separation between religion and the state. What we often call the separation between church and state, but it's really about any religion being promoted unfairly by the state. So when yoga is being taught at the public school setting, you have that question. Isn't this a Hindu practice? And by promoting that practice, aren't we undercutting the separation of the religion and the state, right? Obviously, you could teach about yoga, as we are doing right here, just as you could teach about Christian prayer, for example. But public schools in America would come under fire very quickly if they actually taught classes on prayer, on the practice of prayer, where students were actually engaging in the practice of prayer to the Christian notion of God. So it's been interesting to see some of these court cases. One of the most notable happened in California, where a K-12 school district was sued because yoga was being made part of the gym curriculum or the physical education curriculum. And of course, this angered some people, especially conservative Christians, who felt that this was going against the Constitution's requirement for the separation of church and state. So all of these experts were brought in to discuss whether or not this practice was constitutional in California public schools. And eventually, kind of what was being argued by the school and by the teacher was that all of the specifically religious and spiritual elements of yoga had been removed. And here it was only kind of the physical and mental aspects that remained. And I think that is probably true for most places where yoga is being practiced in non-Hindu context. I think that probably the religious foundations have been removed to a point where you no longer have any sort of constitutional problem about the separation of church and state. I think in some ways, as scholars of religion, perhaps a more important question for us is whether or not it is appropriate for non-Hindus to take a practice like yoga from Hinduism and remove all of the most significant aspects, the religious and spiritual goals that are attached to yoga from that practice, and use it for their own purposes. Right? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's similar to the way that many Christians feel upset when they feel that Christmas, for example, is being celebrated by people who have removed all of the religious meaning to that festival. Obviously, Christmas is a very important Christian festival throughout time, a very important day for most Christians around the world, and it's important because of its religious meaning. So when Christians then see perhaps non-Christians celebrate Christmas without that religious meaning, it can feel like something has been taken from them and all of the deepest meaning has been removed and it has been trivialized. I certainly understand where they're coming from when they make that argument, and I always wonder if we are doing the same thing when we are teaching yoga classes and having yoga studios in America that have removed all of the deepest spiritual and religious meaning from that practice within Hinduism. I'm not sure there's an easy answer, but I think it's a discussion worth having as we think about issues surrounding what is often called cultural appropriation. Needless to say, yoga remains very important within the Hindu tradition with the spiritual elements intact. Another kind of interesting approach to the Hindu faith that has developed throughout time is the use of Tantra or tantric practices and beliefs. Tantra is kind of interesting. It seems to be that it was really an independent system of religious beliefs and practices that existed while Hinduism was the dominant religious culture within India. So it originally began as something separate from or independent of Hinduism. And yet, what we see happening is that around the middle of the first millennium of the Common Era, we start to see Hinduism absorb Tantra or Tantrism into itself. We'll actually see in the next unit that Buddhism will do the same thing. Certain elements of Buddhism will try to make use of some of these tantric beliefs and practices. And again, perhaps this was done in order to show that people who wanted to be involved in Tantra didn't have to choose between Tantra and Hinduism, for example, that Hinduism could make use of some of those tantric beliefs and practices. And for this reason, Tantra is absorbed into Hinduism and into portions of Buddhism in that first millennium of the Common Era. So Tantra, in short, is generally about an experience of the union of energies that kind of dominate our reality. There is something similar here to yin and yang within more Eastern religious thought. It's not the same, and the two are working independently of each other, but there is this idea of energies that kind of flow throughout our universe, and the attempt is to try to unify them. And they are often, just like yin and yang, thought of as kind of separate, in some ways opposed and yet complementary energies. So we often think, for example, of the energies as male and female, just like you do with yin and yang. Male and female is a primary way of thinking about these energies. So in Tantra, you are engaging in kind of doctrines and practices to try to harmonize the energies that are in our world that are often opposed to one another and pull us in separate directions. And if we can harmonize them in our own lives, this will give us a kind of spiritual freedom and power moving forward. Now, eventually what we'll see in Tantra is something of a distinction between what is called left-handed Tantrism and right-handed Tantrism. So most of us are right-handed individuals, and in certain cultures and societies around the world, the right hand is kind of associated with the normal, the safe, and the left hand is abnormal. It's odd. It's perhaps dangerous. Perhaps it's involved in practices that are dirty or unclean. So you have this kind of language used about right hand and left hand that is now used within Tantra. So for example, there are left-handed tantric practices that can actually seem in some ways to be kind of dangerous, risky, perhaps unsafe. This is where you might use substances, alcohol, other drugs, to help lead you into a state of mind that will encourage that union of the energies that are in our world. You might also use sexual practices, right? Ordinarily, within Hinduism, within Tantra, sex should only be engaged in with one's spouse. And yet in Tantra, you might have a religious practice where you engage in sexual intercourse with someone who is not your spouse, someone of the opposite sex, in order to quite literally experience the union of the male and the female, right? And you want it to be with someone who's not your spouse because it's not about the relationship between these two individuals. This is a more focused spiritual practice to try to experience the union of male and female energies, right? Again, so a practice that would be ordinarily unacceptable becomes acceptable within this spiritual context. Again, you will also have right-handed practices, which are more normal, which are safer, etc. One of the most interesting of the right-handed practices that I've typed here on the screen is Kundalini Yoga. So it's a kind of yoga, it's a kind of meditation that will make use of those physical, spiritual, mental aspects, but specifically with the goal of creating that union of energies. So in Kundalini Yoga, there is this sense that all of us as individuals, whether we are male or female, have both the male and female energies located within us. Typically, the idea here is that the female energy is located at the base of our spine. And through this practice of meditation, we are encouraging that female energy to uncoil itself. It's kind of seen as coiled up like a snake, and it needs to unwind itself, working its way up through our torso, up our spine, through these various energy points or chakras, and eventually experience a union with the male source of energy that is located at the base of our skull. So again, this is a safer practice. It's in some ways, more symbolic than actually engaging in sex with someone of the opposite gender, but it's still trying to encourage within your own life the kind of spiritual experience of the union of male and female, of these two energies, to produce a kind of spiritual power and freedom going forward. Again, Tantra is something that is absorbed into Hinduism. That doesn't mean that every Hindu is going to be engaging in tantric practices, either of the left-handed or right-handed variety. And it doesn't mean that every Hindu is going to hold certain tantric beliefs. Remember, Hinduism represents a plurality of traditions, and the tantric kind of element there is certainly one aspect of the larger tradition of Hinduism, but we have to always keep in mind the diversity and complexity that is found within this religion.